September 19, 1945. Victory over Japan had been declared just weeks earlier, and across the United States, the machinery of war was grinding to a halt. In prisoner of war camps from California to Maine, German soldiers who had spent years behind American barbed wire prepared for their return to a defeated homeland. Families celebrated the end of fighting, churches held services of thanksgiving, and the nation looked forward to peace after years of sacrifice and loss. But at Camp Hearne, Texas, a small facility nestled in the rolling countryside between Houston and Dallas, something extraordinary was unfolding that would challenge everything Americans believed about loyalty, patriotism, and the nature of love itself. Camp administrators had discovered a series of letters hidden beneath a barracks floorboard during a routine inspection. Love letters written in careful English and passionate German, exchanged between German prisoners and American women who worked at the facility. The discovery threatened to ignite a scandal that would reach all the way to Washington and expose relationships that violated every social norm and military regulation of the time. How could American women, many of them with husbands or brothers fighting against Germany, fall in love with the enemy? How could German soldiers, indoctrinated to view Americans as inferior and corrupt, give their hearts to the women of the nation that had defeated them? The questions seemed to have no acceptable answers, yet the evidence was undeniable. The letters spoke of deep emotional connection, of shared hopes and dreams, of love that had somehow bloomed in the most unlikely and forbidden circumstances. They revealed a complexity to the prisoner of war experience that most Americans had never considered, a human dimension that contradicted the simple narratives of heroes and villains that had sustained the nation through years of total war. Before we explore the remarkable love stories that developed behind the barbed wire of Camp Hearne, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins more than 2 years earlier, in March of 1943, when the first transport of German prisoners arrived in rural Texas. The war was still raging in Europe and North Africa, and American communities were deeply divided about hosting enemy soldiers on their soil. Some saw it as a practical necessity, providing labor for farms and industries depleted by American men serving overseas. Others viewed it as an outrage, bringing the enemy into the heart of America while their sons were dying on foreign battlefields. Among the 300 German prisoners who arrived that spring morning was Klaus Reinhardt, a 28-year-old former schoolteacher from Munich who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1941. He had never wanted to be a soldier, had never believed in the grand promises of the Third Reich, but like millions of other German men, he had been swept into military service, whether he wanted it or not. He had been captured in Tunisia during the final collapse of German forces in North Africa in May of 1942, spending months in temporary camps in Algeria and Morocco before being shipped across the Atlantic to this strange, flat landscape of cotton fields and endless sky. Klaus stepped off the transport truck with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had survived the war, at least so far, but now faced an unknown future in a land he had been taught to despise. He carried with him a small leather-bound book of Goethe's poetry, the only possession that had survived his capture, and a worn photograph of his younger sister Anna, whom he had not heard from in over a year. The photograph showed her at 17, smiling in the garden of their family home in Munich, a moment of innocence from before the war had consumed everything. The people of Hearne, Texas, population 4,000, had never seen anything quite like the spectacle of 300 German prisoners marching through their town toward the newly constructed camp. Shop owners came to their doorways, abandoning customers to witness the arrival. Children pointed and stared, some with fear, others with curiosity about these men who looked surprisingly ordinary despite being the enemy. Women clutched their purses tighter, uncertain whether to feel threatened or simply fascinated by the first Germans most of them had ever seen in person. The prisoners wore uniforms dyed dark blue to distinguish them from American soldiers, with large white letters spelling PW painted across their backs in white paint. They marched in formation, maintaining the military discipline that had been drilled into them since their induction into the German army, even though they were now captives rather than soldiers. Their faces showed exhaustion from the long journey, but also a strange relief. They were out of combat, away from the constant threat of death that had defined their lives for months or years. Camp Hearne itself sprawled across 200 acres of former farmland, surrounded by double rows of barbed wire fence topped with coils of additional wire, with guard towers positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter. Inside the wire, the camp was divided into several compounds, each housing barracks, a mess hall, and recreation areas where prisoners could spend their limited free time. The American Army had constructed the facility quickly, using prefabricated materials and prisoner labor from earlier arrivals who had been brought to Texas in the initial waves of captives from the North African campaign. The buildings were functional rather than comfortable, designed to house enemy prisoners at minimum cost while meeting the basic requirements of the Geneva Convention. Captain William Foster, the camp commander, was a career military officer from Virginia who had served in World War I and understood the complexities of managing enemy prisoners from his experience in that earlier conflict. He believed in firm discipline but also in treating prisoners according to international standards, having seen firsthand how poorly treated prisoners became sources of constant trouble and resistance. Among the American staff Captain Foster assembled was Margaret Sullivan, a 32-year-old woman from nearby Bryan who had recently been widowed under circumstances that still felt surreal and devastating. Her husband, Lieutenant Robert Sullivan, had been killed during the D-Day landings in Normandy just months after their second wedding anniversary, his life ending on a French beach while helping to liberate Europe from the Nazi regime. Margaret had received the telegram while teaching summer classes at the local elementary school, the words blurring before her eyes as her world collapsed into grief and emptiness. Margaret had no children, and her grief had left her hollow and searching for purpose in a life that suddenly seemed to have no direction or meaning. When she saw the job posting for a translator at the new prisoner of war camp, she applied immediately, driven by a need to do something useful rather than simply exist in the empty apartment she had shared with Robert. She had studied German in college at the University of Texas, part of a language program that seemed quaint and useless until war made it suddenly valuable and even essential. Her professor had been a German immigrant named Dr. Heinrich Weber, who had fled the rise of Hitler in the early 1930s and dedicated himself to teaching Americans about the Germany he had loved before it had been corrupted by National Socialism. He had taught Margaret not just the language but the literature, the poetry, the philosophy, the culture of a nation that would soon become America's most dangerous enemy in a global conflict. Now, standing in the camp administrative building on that first day of prisoner arrivals, Margaret watched through the window as the German prisoners were processed and assigned to their barracks. She felt a confusing mixture of emotions swirling inside her chest. Anger at the men who represented the regime that had killed her husband. Curiosity about these individuals who looked surprisingly young and ordinary rather than like the brutal monsters depicted in war propaganda. And underneath it all, a strange recognition of shared humanity that unsettled her deeply. The first weeks at Camp Hearne established the routines that would govern daily life for the next 2 years. German prisoners were assigned to work details, some within the camp maintaining facilities, repairing buildings, and managing the essential tasks of running the compound, while others were sent out to local farms to help with the cotton harvest and other agricultural labor that was desperately needed due to the shortage of workers. The labor was supervised but not brutal, and the prisoners received wages in camp scrip that they could use to purchase small luxuries from the canteen, items like cigarettes, chocolate, writing paper, and toiletries that made life in captivity slightly more bearable. Margaret's role as translator meant she interacted with prisoners daily, facilitating communication between camp administration and the German compound leaders who had been appointed to manage internal prisoner affairs. The prisoners had organized themselves according to their own internal hierarchy, with senior officers maintaining authority even in captivity, and she quickly learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of men who were simultaneously defeated enemies and human beings struggling with homesickness, uncertainty, and fear about what the future held. Klaus Reinhardt first encountered Margaret during a routine administrative meeting in the camp office about 3 weeks after his arrival. He had been appointed as one of the compound representatives because of his education and his reasonable command of English, learned during his university years in Munich when he had studied to become a teacher. When he entered the small office and saw her sitting behind the desk, papers spread before her and sunlight from the window highlighting the sadness in her eyes, he felt something unexpected wash over him. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition of a kindred spirit. She looked up at him with eyes that held the same deep sadness he recognized because he carried the same weight of loss and displacement in his own chest. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk with a professional manner that barely concealed her own discomfort at sitting across from a German soldier. "Please sit, Mr. Reinhardt. We need to discuss the work assignments for your compound." Her German was precise, textbook correct but lacking the natural rhythm and colloquialisms of a native speaker, the kind of formal accuracy that came from academic study rather than lived experience. Klaus sat down carefully, aware of the absurdity of the situation and the strange reversal of power it represented. Here he was, an enemy prisoner, about to have a civil conversation with an American woman about work schedules and food rations as if they were colleagues rather than captor and captive. He responded in English, his accent thick, but his words clear and carefully chosen. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. I am here to represent my comrades and ensure their concerns are properly communicated." Their initial conversation was purely professional, focused on the mundane details of camp administration, work assignments, and the various practical concerns that arose from housing 300 men. But Klaus noticed small things that suggested depths beneath her professional exterior. As spring turned to summer in 1943, the rhythms of Camp Hearne became familiar to both prisoners and staff, creating a strange normalcy around the fundamentally abnormal situation of housing enemy soldiers in the heart of Texas. The initial tension of having German prisoners in the community gradually eased as local residents realized the prisoners posed no threat to their safety or way of life. In fact, their labor proved invaluable to farms struggling with severe worker shortages, and the prisoners themselves seemed more interested in surviving captivity with dignity than causing any trouble or attempting escape into hostile territory. Margaret's translation duties expanded beyond simple administrative tasks as camp officials recognized her skills and reliability. She began conducting English classes for prisoners who wanted to learn the language, sessions held twice weekly in one of the recreation barracks that had been set aside for educational and cultural activities. The classes were voluntary, but attendance was consistently high, often including 30 or 40 men. The prisoners understood that English skills might prove valuable, whether they eventually returned to Germany or, as some secretly hoped, found ways to remain in America after the war ended. Klaus became a regular student in Margaret's classes, though his English was already more advanced than most of the other prisoners who attended. He claimed he wanted to improve his pronunciation and expand his vocabulary beyond the basic conversational level, but the truth was far more complicated and dangerous. The classroom gave him an excuse to spend time in her presence, to hear her voice explaining grammar rules and English idioms, to watch the way her face softened when a student finally grasped a difficult concept after struggling with it for weeks. The classes revealed unexpected dimensions to both teacher and students that contradicted everything they had been taught about each other. Margaret discovered that these enemy soldiers were not the monsters propaganda had portrayed them as being. They were farmhands and shopkeepers, students and fathers, mechanics and musicians, men who had been swept into a war most of them never wanted and had fought in with varying degrees of enthusiasm or reluctance. Many had joined the Wehrmacht out of duty or coercion rather than ideological commitment to National Socialism. Some had been ardent believers once, but now carried doubt and profound disillusionment about what they had fought for. Klaus, in turn, saw in Margaret something that contradicted everything he had been taught about Americans during his indoctrination in the Wehrmacht. She was intelligent and genuinely cultured, familiar with German literature and philosophy in ways that surprised and impressed him. She had read Goethe and Schiller, could discuss Kant and Hegel, understood the cultural traditions that had shaped German civilization before National Socialism had corrupted it. She treated the prisoners with respect rather than contempt, seeing them as individuals rather than a faceless enemy mass deserving only hatred. During one class in late June, Margaret asked the students to share memories from their lives before the war, a speaking exercise meant to practice past tense constructions and descriptive vocabulary. By autumn of 1943, something had shifted in the careful distance Margaret and Klaus maintained during their interactions. A change so gradual that neither could identify exactly when professional courtesy had transformed into something deeper and far more dangerous. Their conversations had gradually extended beyond English lessons and administrative matters into territory that felt forbidden and thrilling. They discussed literature, comparing American and German authors and debating the merits of different literary traditions. They explored philosophy, carefully avoiding direct political discussions but examining ideas about human nature, morality, the meaning of suffering, and what constitutes home and belonging. These conversations happened in fragments, stolen moments when Margaret needed Klaus to translate complex messages between camp administration and prisoner representatives. Or when he arrived early for English class and found her alone in the classroom preparing materials. They never explicitly acknowledged what was growing between them, perhaps because naming it would force them to confront its complete impossibility and the devastating consequences discovery would bring. But others began to notice the subtle changes in how they interacted, the way their eyes lingered on each other slightly too long, the careful attention they paid to each other's words. Private Jackson, one of the younger guards who had been assigned to supervise the educational activities, mentioned to Captain Foster that Mrs. Sullivan seemed to spend considerable time with the German prisoner Reinhardt, more than seemed strictly necessary for her duties. The captain noted this observation but took no immediate action, trusting Margaret's professionalism and seeing no obvious violation of the regulations that prohibited fraternization between staff and prisoners. What Captain Foster did not see, could not see, were the letters. Klaus had begun writing to Margaret, carefully composed messages in English that demonstrated his growing mastery of the language and revealed his inner thoughts with increasing vulnerability. He left them hidden in agreed locations they had established through coded conversation, a book in the camp library with a note tucked between specific pages, a translation request with personal words hidden among official text, messages that allowed them to communicate without speaking directly. Margaret knew she should report this correspondence, should shut down any communication beyond professional necessity, and maintain the boundaries her position required. Instead, she found herself writing responses, equally careful, equally aware of the terrible transgression each letter represented. In one letter, Klaus wrote about the day he had been conscripted, how he had stood in the Munich train station saying goodbye to his sister Anna, promising he would return safely while knowing the promise might be a lie. He described his growing shame at serving a regime whose true nature he had come to despise, his relief at being captured and removed from combat, his fear that he had lost everything that made life meaningful. Margaret responded with her own confession, describing in painful detail the telegram that informed her of Robert's death, the empty months that followed when she moved through life like a ghost. The confession Margaret and Klaus shared through their letters that November evening changed everything and nothing simultaneously. They could not be together openly, could barely speak privately without arousing suspicion, yet they both knew with certainty they had crossed into emotional territory from which there was no return and no easy escape. They were in love, impossibly and dangerously in love, in a time and place that could never accept what they felt for each other without viewing it as betrayal of the most fundamental kind. Margaret lay awake at night in her small apartment in Bryan, wrestling with guilt that felt physically crushing and inescapable. Robert had been dead less than 18 months, and she was falling in love with a German soldier, one of the men her husband had died fighting against on the beaches of Normandy. The betrayal felt monstrous, a violation of everything she thought she stood for and believed about loyalty and honor. Yet she could not force herself to feel differently about Klaus, despite knowing how wrong it seemed. He was nothing like the propaganda caricatures of brutal Nazi soldiers that appeared in newsreels and posters. He was gentle, thoughtful, intellectually curious, deeply troubled by the war and Germany's actions, carrying his own burden of guilt for having served a regime he now recognized as evil. Klaus faced his own agonizing internal conflicts that left him unable to sleep most nights. He wrote in his journal about the impossible contradiction of loving an American woman, while his sister and mother remained in Germany, possibly suffering from Allied bombing raids, possibly already dead. He questioned whether his feelings were genuine love or simply the desperate attachment of a lonely prisoner grasping at any human connection in the midst of captivity and isolation. Yet when he saw Margaret across the compound or sat in her classroom, all doubts dissolved into absolute certainty that what he felt was real and transformative. They were not alone in their forbidden love, they would discover. Throughout Camp Hearne, other relationships were quietly developing between German prisoners and American women who worked at the facility or in the surrounding community. Nurse Helen Crawford, who worked in the camp infirmary treating injuries and illnesses, had grown close to Friedrich Müller, a German medic who had been assigned to assist with medical duties due to his training and experience. Their relationship began professionally as they worked side by side treating everything from minor cuts to serious illnesses, but evolved as they discovered shared values and unexpected compatibility. Helen was 26, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and had moved to Texas from Ohio specifically to work at the camp after responding to a recruitment notice. Her family had German heritage going back 3 generations, and she felt profoundly conflicted about the war from the beginning, unable to fully embrace the simplified narrative of good versus evil when her own grandfather had come from the same country now designated as the enemy. Friedrich reminded her of that grandfather, who had immigrated to America in the early 1900s, seeking opportunity and freedom. He carried the same gentle manner, the same careful attention to others' suffering, the same quiet dignity. The careful secrecy surrounding these forbidden relationships began to unravel in the spring of 1944 when accumulated small observations and suspicious behaviors finally reached a critical mass that could no longer be ignored by camp authorities and local community members. A local farmer who employed prison labor on his property had noticed the way one of his hired hands, a German prisoner named Johann Becker, looked at Sarah Mitchell when she occasionally visited the farm to bring supplies or deliver messages. The farmer mentioned this observation to his wife during dinner one evening, and she mentioned it to her sister the next day, who mentioned it to the president of the local church women's society at their weekly meeting, setting off a chain reaction of gossip and moral outrage. Within days, rumors circulated through Hearne about inappropriate relationships between German prisoners and American women, spreading through beauty parlors and grocery stores, church gatherings, and social clubs. The stories grew more scandalous with each retelling, fueled by wartime paranoia and genuine shock that American women could develop feelings for enemy soldiers while American boys were still dying overseas in both Europe and the Pacific. Captain Foster received an angry delegation of townspeople demanding investigation and immediate accountability. How could American women consort with the enemy while American soldiers were making the ultimate sacrifice? What kind of moral decay did this represent? The pressure forced Foster to take action he had been deliberately avoiding, hoping the relationships would either fade naturally or remain discreet enough to avoid public scandal. He instituted stricter regulations separating male prisoners from female staff members, limited translation sessions to supervised group settings only, eliminated most of the educational programs that had created opportunities for extended interaction, and issued a stern warning to all female employees that fraternization with prisoners would result in immediate termination and potential legal consequences, including possible prosecution for aiding the enemy. For Margaret, these new restrictions meant she could no longer conduct English classes or have private translation meetings with Klaus for any reason. Their carefully constructed opportunities for contact vanished almost overnight, eliminated by regulations designed specifically to prevent exactly what had been happening. She was reassigned to purely administrative duties that kept her confined to the main office, processing paperwork and managing records, deliberately isolated from any contact with the prisoner compounds or the men housed within them. Klaus felt the separation like a physical wound, an amputation of something essential to his survival and sanity. The routines that had allowed him to see Margaret, even briefly, even in the presence of others, were suddenly gone without warning or explanation. He went through his daily work assignments mechanically, his body performing tasks while his thoughts constantly circled back to her, wondering if she was well, if she thought of him, if their connection would survive the forced separation. But love, especially forbidden love, finds ways to persist against all obstacles and prohibitions. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day brought wild celebrations across America, with church bells ringing and crowds filling streets in spontaneous expressions of joy and relief. But for the German prisoners at Camp Hearne and the women who loved them in secret, the end of the war in Europe meant the beginning of an agonizing countdown toward inevitable separation. Repatriation orders would soon arrive from the War Department, sending the prisoners back to a defeated Germany that many of them no longer recognized as home, separating them potentially forever from the women who had become their reasons for hope and their visions of a different future. Klaus received word in late May that his compound would be among the first scheduled for return to Europe, with departure planned for late June to coincide with the availability of transport ships. The news left him feeling hollow and desperate, as if all the air had been suddenly sucked from his lungs. He had survived the war, survived the dangers of combat and the uncertainty of captivity, only to face separation from the one person who had made his survival feel meaningful rather than simply a matter of biological persistence. The irony was crushing that peace should bring more pain than war had delivered. Margaret received the repatriation schedule as part of her administrative duties, seeing Klaus's name on the transport list among hundreds of others scheduled for return. She walked mechanically through the rest of her workday, maintaining professional composure and completing her tasks with her usual efficiency, but the moment she reached her apartment that evening, she allowed herself to break down completely. She sat on her kitchen floor and cried for the second time since Robert's death, great heaving sobs that felt like they might tear her apart from the inside, mourning a future that could never exist, and a love that circumstances made impossible. But grief slowly hardened into determination as the initial shock of the repatriation schedule gave way to desperate planning. Margaret began researching immigration law with the same intensity she had once applied to her graduate studies, spending evenings at the local library searching for any legal provision that might allow a former enemy prisoner to remain in the United States or return after repatriation. She wrote letters to government officials, consulted with attorneys, contacted refugee organizations, seeking any path through the bureaucratic maze that separated her from the future she wanted. The legal landscape, she discovered, was complex and deliberately unfriendly to former enemy nationals. German soldiers faced severe restrictions designed to prevent infiltration and ensure that defeated enemies returned to their homeland to face the consequences of their nation's actions. The only path Margaret could identify required Klaus to return to Germany, establish residency there, apply for immigration from within Germany, secure sponsorship from an American citizen willing to vouch for him, and then wait potentially years for approval through a quota system that severely limited immigration from former enemy nations. The process seemed designed to be impossible, yet it was the only option available. Similar conversations were happening between other couples facing the same devastating separation. The departure day arrived with crushing finality on June 23, 1945, a date that would remain etched in memory for everyone involved in the scene that unfolded. German prisoners from Camp Hearne lined up for final processing, preparing for the journey that would take them first to embarkation points on the East Coast, then across the Atlantic to a Germany that existed now only as a defeated, occupied, divided nation bearing little resemblance to the country they had left. Klaus stood in formation with the other men from his compound, a small canvas bag containing his few possessions slung over his shoulder. Inside the bag was the leather-bound Goethe that had accompanied him through the entire war, the photograph of his sister Anna that showed her smiling in their Munich garden, and letters from Margaret that he had carefully preserved despite the risk they represented if discovered. Margaret watched from a deliberate distance, standing among other administrative staff, as they observed the departure procedures that had been designed to be efficient and impersonal. Camp regulations strictly prohibited personal farewells between staff and prisoners, a rule now being enforced with particular vigilance given the recent scandal. But she managed to catch Klaus's eyes across the compound for one long moment, and they looked at each other with an intensity that communicated everything they could not say aloud, all the love and pain and desperate hope compressed into a single exchange of glances. Then he turned and boarded the transport truck that would carry him away, possibly forever. The journey back to Germany took 3 weeks, a reversal of the voyage Klaus had made as a prisoner 2 years earlier, but fundamentally different in emotional texture. Instead of uncertainty and fear about captivity, he carried a specific plan that felt both fragile and essential. He would return to Munich, search for his family among the chaos and destruction, establish himself however possible in the ruins of post-war Germany, and then apply for immigration to the United States with Margaret as his sponsor, trusting that love could overcome bureaucratic obstacles and political barriers. When Klaus finally reached Munich in mid-July, he found a city transformed beyond recognition by Allied bombing campaigns and Soviet artillery. The neighborhood where he had grown up existed only in fragments, once familiar buildings reduced to hollow shells with walls standing like tombstones, streets rendered unrecognizable by rubble and ruin, the entire landscape of his childhood erased. He searched for weeks before finding his sister Anna living in a displaced persons camp on the outskirts of the city, one of thousands of such camps housing Germans who had lost everything. Their reunion was bittersweet, overwhelming joy at both having survived mixed with devastating grief for their mother, who had died during a bombing raid in February of 1944. Klaus settled into the chaos of post-war Germany, finding work as a translator for American occupation forces employed by the very army that had defeated his nation. The irony was not lost on him that his imprisonment and the English skills he had developed largely to communicate with Margaret now made him valuable in defeated Germany. He wrote to Margaret weekly, long detailed letters describing his efforts to navigate the immigration process, the frustrations and small victories. 20 years after that painful separation at Camp Hearne, Klaus Reinhardt stood in a comfortable living room in Austin, Texas, watching his teenage daughter practice piano, while Margaret prepared dinner in the kitchen of the home they had built together. The journey from German prisoner of war to American citizen, husband, and father had taken 5 years of legal battles, bureaucratic patience, countless setbacks, and unwavering commitment from Margaret, but they had succeeded against odds that seemed impossible in 1945. Their story, and the stories of other couples who had met across barbed wire, became proof that love could bridge even the deepest divisions created by war, offering hope that former enemies could become not just peaceful neighbors, but genuine partners in building a better future.